Perfect. I think we're ready to kick off then. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is going to be a conversation about how we empower employees to grow in the flow of work, but more of a wider contextual conversation about why it's important, what some of the barriers are that stop it happening typically, and how we can overcome them. Now, we're going to run through a few slides to set that context before we dive into the discussion with our panel, but I want to take a moment to introduce who's joining me today, and also for anyone who's not familiar with HowNow and who I am, my name is Gary Stringer. I'm the Content Marketing Manager at HowNow. We are a learning experience platform that works with fast-growing companies like Checkout.com and Depop, all the way up to global enterprises like Investec and Sanofi to bring relevant learning to the flow of work. And I'm joined by two guests today, Adam Lacey, CEO and co-founder at AssembleU, and Anthony Ryland, CEO at Tap Solutions. Adam, I would love it if you could just quickly introduce who you are and what AssembleU do to everyone.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me along, Gary. So my name's Adam. I'm co-founder of AssembleU. And AssembleU is a podcast-style audio learning business. So we specialize in creating short, succinct audio lessons that can be listened to on the go. We focus on things like power skills, so think leadership, productivity, communication, all those types of things. And our goal is to help enable learners to learn more in the time that they have available by delivering them learning in a convenient and easy to use modality, which we think is audio.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that sort of context and the format thing definitely throughout the conversation. And Anthony, for yourself, could you just maybe tell us who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Ryland, as you've heard of from Tap Solutions. It looks like my favorite color is purple. The Tap Solutions, we've been around for about 89 years and very much around looking at helping organizations shape the future of their organizations through organizational development, leadership development, coaching, any kind of intervention that shifts the culture towards where the organization wants to go to.
Perfect. Cool. So yeah, we're going to, like I said, I'm going to set a little bit of context for this discussion before we really dive into this with Adam and Anthony. And Adam and Anthony, feel free to add on your thoughts to anything I'm going to touch on in these slides. Now, to set that context, I think part of the issue around learning in the flow of work is a lack of engagement. Now, for learning to happen, engagement is the primary requirement. So if you think about L&D without engagement, is like a car with no wheels. It's going nowhere, because if people aren't engaged, if they don't see the value, if they're not willing to invest time in your learning initiatives, then there's not really going to be an ability for L&D to drive success. And this is often something that's seen in the data around L&D. So that lack of engagement contributes to the average course completion rate being just 3 to 6%. It contributes to 75% of employees being dissatisfied with their company's L&D function. And it contributes as well massively to this part that 88% of employees report not applying what they've learned at work. Now, the lack of engagement is a key issue, but it's also a symptom of a wider problem. And that leads us to the question of why exactly is engagement so low? Now, there's a temptation when there's a lack of engagement to say, it's a problem with our content. We need to go and make the content more fun, more engaging. It needs to be shorter. It needs to be longer. But often it's not solely a problem with the content. It's to do with the mindset and approach to how it's delivered. So we'll often see people creating content and then going out there to find a problem it solves, rather than creating content for problems to be solved. And that means that learning feels like it's not immediately relevant when it gets pushed out to people. It means that learning feels like an unwanted interruption that delays your ability to learn and perform in the flow of work. When we think about the flow of work as well, often people find it difficult to access the resources they need when they encounter problems in the flow of work, because resources are scattered everywhere. Or if people know where to find resources, it takes them out of the tools they're already using. And that's obviously the enemy of learning in the flow of work and performing in the role. And last of all, we've got the issue that often L&D teams can become the bottleneck or the sole creator for content. And that means they can't create content at the speed that people need it, or they prioritize perfection over timing. So spending months crafting a resource when we know there's a problem to be solved now in the flow of work, and often timing beats perfection in that case. And what's interesting is that employees are telling us they don't want to learn this way. So according to LinkedIn Learning, 68% prefer to learn on the job at work, where they can apply something contextual, where it's relevant to the industry they're in and the role they're in. And 49% want to learn at the point of need, because this is the moment they're facing a challenge, and applying learning would be particularly useful to their performance. But another contextual issue here is that people are switching apps a lot. So according to Asana, we on average are switching between 10 apps 25 times a day. So it makes it really difficult, and it creates a real disconnect between people wanting to learn at their point of need and people being able to learn at their point of need. So hopefully this kind of sets the context for this wider discussion about how do we empower our employees to grow in the flow of work, to close that engagement gap, to stop them switching between apps and switching between context, and to create things that genuinely solve the problems they're facing so it feels relevant. Now, before I stop sharing my screen and bring in Adam and Anthony for their thoughts, I just want to direct you to the Death of the LMS guide, which you'll see in the chat as well. This essentially unpicks this problem with content-first approach to L&D and helps you build a skills-first approach to L&D that really drives that learning in the flow of work by delivering content that's relevant at the right times, at the right moments, to have the right impact. So, Adam and Anthony, I know I've just kind of rattled through that context there to free up time for us to chat, but do either of you have anything you want to add or build upon there, or maybe even kind of contest or disagree with to any point? I would love to hear your thoughts.
I can jump in there first, if that's all right, Adam. It's interesting as we're talking about where does learning go in the flow of work, and to me, actually, why isn't learning part of the flow of work? Because what is work? And if you look at work, then work actually is you being at the top of your game in your skills and knowledge. So actually, I think right from the start, from the title, I think there's an assumption in organizations and in corporate business that actually learning is detached from work, whereas actually it has to be integrated into the two.
Yeah, big time. And I think that's one of the points I wanted to pick up on about this as well, in that, you know, what's the key challenge that we're hearing a lot of the time? And it comes down to a couple of things, really. One of them is culture. And that really does come from the top, you know, as Anthony's saying, is learning detached from work, or is it actually an important part of the KPIs, the OKRs, the targets, people's annual reviews and things like that? And are people rewarded appropriately and given the bandwidth to actually learn? And that's the second big thing that comes up again and again, is time. So, you know, are people being given enough time to learn? So in a lot of cases, there's a real desire to learn, and you can unpick that if you give people and ask people, you know, what they're interested in and where they want to develop. But finding time to do that is really, really tricky. You know, a kind of an urgent request from a client or from a I don't know, a supplier, if something's gone wrong, is always going to trump doing a piece of learning in the majority of cases. And so it's about making sure that that time is given, and that actually learning is appropriately prioritized.
Yeah, and that really speaks a bit to that relevance issue as well. If we know time is an issue for people, and we don't deliver things that are relevant to challenges they're facing in the flow of work, then we're only damaging that reputation for L&D and only widening that gap of engagement. Because like you said, if I'm super time poor and I'm doing something that feels like a waste of time, then what are the chances that I'm going to want to learn again in the future? And that is a real kind of, I think, common pain point. I'd love to know in the chat, actually, if any of these kind of issues that we've just spoken about are resonating with anyone. Anthony, I wanted to dive into, like Adam just said there, these wider issues that we're hearing. And you obviously speak to a lot of HR directors, C-suite, senior L&D people. And when you're having those conversations, what's coming up from a strategic standpoint about the importance of empowering people at their point of need to drive behavior change, to improve their performance, and to ultimately enable people to build skills in the flow of work?
Thanks, Gary. And I've got like 2.5 points on this one. It's to me, when you look at the C-suite, they're obviously looking at the big picture. They're obviously looking at the future. They're looking at the roadblocks that are coming down the line. And I think the one thing that is absolutely top of mind at the moment is the concept of VUCA. If you haven't come across VUCA, it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the world has gone absolutely crazy with the amount of change that's gone on, the amount of unpredictability that's going on. And because of that, that whole command and control, even if it was still going in the organization, is dismantling, because the world is going faster than what C-suites can actually deal with at the center, the feeding in and the feeding out. And I think a great analogy from this is what I hear C-suites saying, CEOs saying, HRD saying, is they want to empower people to be able to make better decisions on the ground. And the great analogy there is, you think about the British Army and the commandos. Commandos have a mission to go and deliver, but when they're on the ground delivering it, new information comes up. If different things happen, they have the empowerment to change what's going on. But that will only come if they can, at the point of time, get the learning and the knowledge and have the empowerment to actually make the decision there. So there's something there about the world is fundamentally in flux, and therefore C-suites are saying, how can we therefore get our organizations to respond quicker? And the second point is really the employment marketplace. We hear those terms, don't we? We've heard them probably 15, 20 years now, war on talent. I mean, that's getting a bit old now. There are probably people entering the marketplace now that have heard that at birth. But there's a real issue with skills at the moment. There's a change in what skills are needed. There's a shortage of some skills. We've got the wrong skills. Skills are needed that we didn't need 5 years ago. So where are we actually developing those skills? So it kind of leads into the whole VUCA piece. We've globalized as organizations, which meant we fed into skills from all around the world. And then at the same time, and then through 2020, 2021, we've had a number of things happen. Main ones being a pandemic where a lot of people went home and then haven't returned back. Just the cultures and the economies in their own countries have moved on, so they can get work and stuff there. But also there's a level of protectionism that's starting to come into the West. So having access to skills around the world is actually getting harder. So what do? Well, you have to grow your own people. But as Adam rightly says, that takes time to develop how you're going to do that, but giving people time every week, every month to actually then go and develop those skills. And so I think retention is now an issue. So I think to summarize what C-suites and HRDs are thinking, I think they're thinking the world is going super fast and retention is now more of an issue than actually attracting the right people.
Yeah, it's definitely something we're seeing in some of the data as well around the war for talent, the skill shortage, because there's a real interesting situation that despite the economic downturn we're seeing, the demand for talent is remaining really high, because we've got the lowest unemployment rate, I think, in nearly half a century in the US, in Europe and Canada. So there's that low unemployment, but there's also now 6 open roles for every person who is qualified to do a job. So there's this skills gap widening. And like you say, for organizations, that means if people aren't progressing in your company and they're skilled, it's kind of easier for them to leave because there's more vacancies for skilled people. But at the same time, if you're trying to hire skills into an organization, that's far more challenging because there's maybe a lack or a lower amount of talent for you to hire. So there's becomes this real need for you to retain the people who do have skills, but more importantly, to upskill people, because it's not sustainable or always possible for you to continue hiring new people in this climate. And yeah, I really like that insight's coming through in the conversations you're having as well. Adam, any thoughts from your end on what Anthony and some of the stuff I just shared there?
Yeah, definitely. So I think businesses are always balancing this kind of immediacy need with the kind of what's coming down the line need, and getting that balance right is really tricky. And I think what Anthony's basically saying, and you're saying, Gary, is that now we are we really have to shift now. So we really have to move from kind of learning being a helpful, a useful part of what we do, to actually learning being a core part of what we do. Because if we don't, then we won't have a business in 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, whatever it is. And it's becoming actually a critical system, or a really critical part of business, more so than it's ever been, exactly because of the macro factors that Anthony talked about. And I think if we drill that down to where that's causing friction and issues within businesses right now, it's great to look at your average learning and development department. We speak to a lot of them, obviously. We're trying to sell our stuff into learning and development managers. I also run a learning and development podcast where we talk to a lot of people about this kind of thing recently. And one of the things that comes up again and again is you've got 1 to 2 people responsible for, in a lot of cases, a business that is 500 to 2,000 bodies, and they are responsible for all areas of learning and development. And so, they have to be experts or specialists in all these different areas. But not only that, it's a very, very limited or small resource to kind of do a meaningful job across such a broad kind of set of people and broad set of skills. And that is really hard, and that's kind of, I think, where companies may need to shift in the future is, okay, as we realign and understand the importance of learning and development, how do we thank you, Karen, how do we make that shift and make more, increase the size of those learning teams, but in the meantime, it's about, as a small learning team, how on earth do I get the most from what I've got? And so that means getting the right technology in place, for example, getting the right getting buy-in from everybody in the business. So bringing line managers on board to really help. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail with some of the other questions and solutions. But I think that's causing a real friction. There's more demands being pushed down onto L&D at the moment, but there's not the extra resource to kind of to pick it up. Yeah,
no, entirely. I think there's this issue with, like Anthony was saying, the world is changing faster than ever, which means, like you alluded to, learning has to be a part of the fabric of our company. We're learning things on the job when problems arise, because we can't always create this formalized way to tackle a particular skill set we're lacking, right? It's not like, if the world is really changing as fast as it is right now, we can't say, well, in 3 months we'll send everyone on a course, for example. We just need that time to build it out. And at the same time, like you said, L&D teams, if they're a small L&D team, they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to build out these big, dedicated, cumbersome courses. So it really does drive us into this mindset of we have to be helping people learn in the flow of work. And to Anthony's point about the special forces as well, having the skill set to kind of learn independently, but also providing them the environment to be able to learn independently by bringing everything into one place, by reducing the barriers to finding what they need. So I think it's really interesting to hear that. And if anyone hasn't noticed, dropped a link in the chat to the podcast that Adam mentioned. And if you sign up, then you'll also get some, I think, some of your research and a guide to L&D engagement, right? So
yeah, we did a 10-part series, and we basically summarized that into a report. So that's available on that page as well. Yeah. You just need to drop your email in, you get that report. So thanks for the plug, Gary. Appreciate that.
No worries. I never miss an opportunity. Cool. So yeah, I think actually, before we move on, are either of you hear any other challenges that make this more difficult for L&D teams to empower people to build skills in the flow of work? Or is there anything else we should touch on before we move into why it's not happening, how we can tackle it? I'm just cautious about if we missed any context or glossed over anything.
The only thing I would add is quite often L&D teams I come across don't feel empowered themselves, so they can walk into the biggest conversations in the organization and be part of it, which I think is partly self-defeating in their own mindsets, where they might have tried things in the past and been knocked back, but also sponsorship from the top of the organization saying learning is really super important. So that's probably the only thing I'll throw in to the top of the conversation.
Yeah, it comes back to that point on culture, doesn't it? If it's revered at the top, that will flow down through the business. And certainly for us, we notice a big difference with companies that take learning a lot more seriously, and where it's more part of the fabric of the business than where it's not, and it's more pushing water up a hill when it's the latter type thing, to try and get things to happen and to make a change. My only other point, Gary, is quite a tactical one, I guess, is mandated training. It can sometimes ruin the learning experience for a lot of people. And, Anthony kind of touched on this earlier. If you give people a bad experience or experience that isn't relevant to them, they then, anything that comes from that department is then lumped with the same opinion. And it's often not the case. There's quite a big difference, as we know as learning professionals, between having to do your anti-bribery and then kind of your self-development that is probably more interesting, engaging, and doable. That's a small thing, but it's something to think about when if learning is responsible for some of the mandated courses as well, which it often is in businesses.
Yeah, no, agreed. I think mandated training is the perfect example of sometimes when training is delivered at the convenience of maybe the L&D team as opposed to the individual, because it's super easy to just enroll everyone, send out these blanket emails, but it's a bit more difficult to spend that time crafting, like, who exactly is this relevant to, and how do we make sure it's adding value to everyone and doesn't damage the L&D brand in the business.
The tricky thing is, I think most people don't have much control over that. Everyone needs to do it for a regulatory or insurance purpose in a lot of cases, and so it's a kind of it's a fault in society, basically, rather than a fault of anybody working in learning and development, that we have to do these things to basically tick a box to cover our backs. It's as simple as that, and it's frustrating. But I think I guess if more can be made of there's a difference between the two, that could possibly help as a solution.
Yeah, often it's just a messaging or a branding exercise, really tapping into the importance of doing a particular training, or how on a personal level does this relate to you and your role, because there is a overlap. Even all the most mandated stuff we have to do, if we position it correctly to people, there will be more resonance with this is related to my role or what the company's mission is. I guess there's ways to tie it in. I wanted to move on to a stat that I sort of shared at the start. Around 88% of employees report they're not applying what they're learning at work. I'd love to dive into why this breakdown is happening. Now, there's a few interesting comments in the chat as well around overwhelming people with too much content. I think comes back to this content relevance part. So maybe it's that people aren't applying what they're learning at work because it's not relevant, or because they're overwhelmed, or because it's not in a format that can be applied in the flow of work. But Anthony, maybe kick us off. Is there any thoughts from your end about why this breakdown in application is happening? Why aren't people applying what they're currently learning on the job?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? It's I sometimes think it comes back to Donald Rumsfeld. I mean, nobody knows him as an American politician from about 30 years ago, who talked about known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And I think sometimes it starts from the top. When we're looking at what we perceive that our people need to learn, we use a blunt instrument called a training needs analysis. We go and ask people what development they need. And quite often, people will ask for things that they've heard about. So I've heard about these topics, so therefore I need to do this. I need to do a management program because I've heard of that. So right from the start, it's almost like you're having a closed subject matter. And therefore people learn that and they think, well, that's not actually applicable what I really needed. And I think actually there are new learning skills that are emerging. And it's from some of my conversations with HRDs and heads of talent. They're finding it really hard to get traction internally to actually start getting budget for this stuff. And what I'm talking about is, there was a conference, HR conference in Romania that I did in 2018 about the future of work. And I put up there at the time, when AI comes, these are going to be the skills and behaviors we need to develop. And we're talking curiosity, we're talking critical thinking, we're talking the ability to systems think, the things that AI can't do. Going to your organization saying we need to build curiosity and critical thinking is a really hard thing to do at the moment, because where's the value going to come from? Well, it's going to come from in the future when generative AI takes more of our roles. So I think sometimes why people aren't applying learning could be eventually the learning that eventually makes it through the filtering system into the content system actually maybe isn't what's needed. And we need to think about how we can reshape that. And then, of course, I mean, we've been talking about learning in the flow of work. There still is the case for learning prior to the need. And I think an example of that is this kind of idea of curiosity critical thinking. If you develop the concept of critical thinking prior to needing it, it's those skills that you then use in the flow of work and challenge back what you're doing. And could I do this better? Could I enhance this? So there's some knowledge that you need at the point of the flow of work, but you also need to know what you should be looking for at that point. So I think summarizing, I think very much we need to go beyond the obvious, thinking about what is it people need to learn rather than what they think they need to learn. And this obviously we need to listen to our people, but actually I think sometimes we are the experts in learning. We can bring knowledge into the conversation.
Yeah, funny enough, I had an interesting conversation with someone a while ago on the podcast about learning preferences. He's making the point that although it's good we hear people out, the idea is not maybe to do what people prefer, but it's to make them successful and to give them the knowledge they need to perform on the job. So I agree, there's a fine balance to be struck between kind of wanting and needing. And I love this point about the pre-flow of work stuff as well, because it's easy to get maybe in that mindset of it's just about accessing stuff at the point of need. But you're right, if I, for example, am in the marketing team and I need to build up my public relations skills, it's more a balance of how do I learn the fundamentals of what PR is? And then when it comes to write a press release, how do I then find that in the flow of work? Like, what's the structure of a press release? That's a good resource for the point of need, but the fundamentals aren't necessarily things I can learn at the point of need. So it's, I think, a balance between recognizing where those two things split apart. So that's kind of my 2 cents. But Adam, any thoughts on kind of what we just shared, but also this overall subject of the application breakdown?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying there. I think there are certain subjects that are important to pre-learn in order to be impactful, and then there are certain things that you just need at the point of need. And like a good example, and I've seen this before in businesses, is say you're rolling out a new piece of technology, a new bit of software or something like that. You get a load of people in a meeting room and you talk them through how to use that piece of software. There's your training intervention, right, we're rolling this out over the next few weeks, this is what you need to do, blah blah blah. Is that helpful? Because in 30 days most people will have probably forgotten that, versus creating a bank of 5-minute videos that shows people what they need to do, that they can access when they need it. So I think, as a learning and development professional, you've got to think really carefully about what's the purpose of the learning. Are we trying to just show people what to do? Is a piece of learning or a program better, or can this be solved by having a checklist or something super simple that's just an easy to access resource that people can grab when they need it? Or are we designing for the future, in which case, yes, we're gonna need something maybe more more styled, more designed, something to get people thinking and reflecting. But then how are we making sure that knowledge is retained over time? So it's, the whole like one and done program thing is not great, because you might learn about something and then you may not have the opportunity to apply it for 6 months. So are the resources people can come back to, are they being nudged in the right direction to help them develop? Is their line manager talking to them about these development opportunities and how they're progressing against them and all the rest of it? So I think from a more tactical point of view, all those things can contribute positively. And if they're not being done, can often lead to why people are, that 88% figure that we saw.
Yeah, there's something you mentioned there that's a perfect segue to the next part of this conversation, but it's not necessarily knowing everything, but knowing where to find it. Like that checklist example, it's if I'm about to do this thing and there's a step-by-step process, where's the resource that guides me through that, rather than having to remember everything off the top of my head. And it moves us nicely onto the issue of tech, because as we saw earlier, there's this issue with people wanting to learn at the point of need, but always either having to switch context to find what they need, or not knowing where to find something, because I guess 2 competing issues. One, either our tech doesn't integrate with each other or talk to each other that well, or there's just too much different tech being used, and there's loads of scattered resources. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what kind of role technology can play in enhancing that integration into the workflow. And I guess, Adam, a bit of a loaded question to you on this front is the approach from Assemble You really does consider that context as well. So I guess it's kind of two questions. How can tech in general enhance integration, but how can tech that's appropriate for the point of need also help people learn at the point of need?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And yeah, modality is the way that like we as a company are addressing it. And I think, think very carefully about modality and how you roll out learning and what is going to be the most appropriate for that group of people. Are they in a car all day, in which case audio is great. Are they in a place where they can't really listen to something, but it needs to be in person or whatever? So really think carefully about modality and use all the different tools in your toolbox. But then it also comes down to systems. And you mentioned at the beginning, Gary, about 10 was it 10 different apps 25 times a day or something like that? I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm spot on in terms of that is my daily that is my daily use right now. And quite a few people we spoke to when we did the Learning and Development Challenges podcast series 1 was a lot of the conversations were, until you're at the point of really needing a system, utilize and leverage that existing tech. And I think you can still leverage that existing tech, and you've got to put learning where people are. So, you've got to use Teams, you've got to use Slack, you've got to use all these different tools at your disposal. And yes, it can link back through to a system, but there has to be one place where, or a multitude of places where people actually are and that people are actually using to make sure they're accessing it. And you've got to remove those barriers as much as possible. So number of clicks to access something, make sure your search is really good. If someone wants to find something, there's nothing more frustrating than searching and you get naff search results, is there? Because everyone's used to Google. That's the standard, basically. So it's all that kind of stuff, and just thinking about that, and then helping people with their development. So setting up systems and programs that nudge people to do their learning. I think Kevin just mentioned lunch and learn groups. These are great, and this is something we've seen a few times work in practice, almost like a book club kind of concept where people read, listen, watch something, come together as a cohort, discuss it. Everyone's holding each other accountable, and yeah, you can have quite an on the ground kind of impact with that sort of approach.
Yeah, I love what you said there as well about this perception maybe that if people can't find what they need, then the tools we're using get this bad rep. And someone mentioned in the chat is actually moving so fast I've lost track of who it was, so that's great to see. But about getting people to use the internal intranet, and often that experience you explained where someone searches, they can't find what they need, it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. I search in this place, I don't find it, so I don't bother doing it again. Worse than that, I tell other people that it's not particularly useful for me finding that stuff, and it only damages the brand, the perception over time. And before, just quickly, Anthony, to bring you in, some personal experience around what you said about removing the barriers there. The way we use HowNow internally at HowNow is a good example of that, because we integrate with Google Doc, Google Drive, the tools I normally use to capture stuff. We curate the stuff that I would normally find on YouTube, for example, on blogs, into one place. And then we integrate it with Slack. So for me, if I'm in Slack and someone asks me a question, I never have to leave Slack to find the resource. It means that the tools I'm using natively, the ones where my interactions with people happen, I'm not being disconnected from that to go and find the resource and either share that with someone. And then the more people ask me and I share resources with them, the more that builds up that snowball effect of a search first culture. People are seeing that actually I don't have to leave Slack either. If I just search using the sort of HowNow integration, I'll find what I need. So I can, from a personal perspective, completely relate to that sort of journey and the friction and the barriers you mentioned there. But I think I've reached my limit for mentioning HowNow on the webinar today. So Anthony, over to you. In terms of tech, how can we use that? And any of your thoughts on what Adam just shared there as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I haven't mentioned my organisation that much yet either. So I was looking at a comment from Sam actually, and I'll also say that the wealth of stuff coming through is amazing. I'm going to try and read everything on the way back. and Sam using Miro. I use Mural, same collaboration kind of concept to engage people more because a lot of learning has gone virtual. In answer to your question, I always take a mental step back and try and think of actually how technology can help. Well, actually, I think technology, going back 20 odd years, you used to go to work because you get the full tech. You used to get a laptop because you couldn't afford one at home. You used to have access to the internet when you're at work, so you could do all your stuff at work when nobody was looking, and everything. And I think the world has changed now, where actually outside of work is much easier to deal with than inside of work in a lot of cases. So the moral of that story is how can we make the ability to learn inside of work like outside of work? So, for example, if I want to cook a kedgeree tonight, then I'll go onto YouTube, find a video on how to cook a kedgeree. I still need the basic cooking skills, but actually that's where I'll get my on-time learning. So it means it needs to be in the flow of work. I loved, Adam, your mention of nudge. I'm a great believer in nudge theory. If you want to get a cultural shift, nudge theory is the way to do it. One of the pioneers was the British government. Getting people to eat so many fruit and veg a day is a great case study to go back and have a look at that, how you can bring it into your organization. But then I also think that it goes back to senior leadership, and it goes back to role modeling. Role modeling is the oldest form of learning that we have, social learning theory. So if people at the top of the organization are talking about learning, talking about what have you done this week to sharpen your saw, as Stephen Covey would put it, then you're more likely to do something. You have the great statements from places like Google, and it's like 10, 15 years ago that they're saying 20% of your time is to develop yourself. Now, whether you use it or not, that's debatable. Yes, I used to work at Samsung. We used to talk to Google all the time about it, but it's that statement of intent that then gives people permission or perceived permission to then go and learn in the flow of work, learn with technology. So I think there's something very much there around role modeling as well as in-time technology, etc.
Yeah, no, the Google one's a great example because actually Google have this Googler to Googler peer knowledge sharing system that actually most of their learning internally happens through their subject matter experts. And I think that speaks to the role modeling from the top and the freedom to do it. But also, if your subject matter expert's teaching it to you, it'll be more applicable to the flow of work and the tools you use. So a perfect, nice bow on that one, because I'm just conscious about time to move on to something else along these lines, non-tech related, but essentially, often we find that learning in the flow of work or learning we try and do isn't relevant because it doesn't relate to a challenge we're facing in the moment or an overall business goal, which means it's far less likely to be useful and far less likely to drive impact. So I think part of the way we can improve learning in the flow of work is to sync up with our team leaders, our overall business goals, our people's individual challenges they face at their moments of need, and cater our learning to that so that not only is it applicable, it's super relevant, and it gives people a better perception of learning internally. So Anthony, maybe continue sort of with you there, but tell us a bit more about your views on that. Can we, if we sync up to our people's and businesses goals, can we actually deliver better learning for the flow of work?
My thought immediately goes to, well, if you're not, what are you doing in the organization? Sorry, always controversial statement. What is the purpose of a HR function, a learning function, if you're not connected into the strategic business goals? So if you're not, you've got to find a way to do that. So it means as a learning function, as a HR function, you need to be at the top table. You need to be developing your systems thinking skills. So if I pull this lever, what does that mean for the entire organization? How does that align with my north and the organization's north to make us achieve whatever goals they might be? They're not always profit related. If you work in the third sector, then actually it's about helping people, but actually they need to be able to align for that. You need to create a direct line of sight. So as HR, as a learning function, as a talent function, we need to be owning the productivity conversation. We need to be owning the automation conversation. The future state of the organization, we need to know that as soon or as the C-suite know that as well, because we need to be putting in place, because of the time lag, we need to be putting in place what's needed for that organization. So I'm a really, really big believer that we need to be in those big conversations. And if we're not, we're doing a disservice towards a function. And I know it's really easy for me to sit here and say that, and it's very hard to do it inside of organizations. But find yourself sponsors and work your way through the politics with a small p to actually get to yourself to where you need to go. And I'm also not a great believer of tracking things, because if we can prove that people learning in the flow of work works, then why do we then have to slow it all down and turn it into a vanilla thing just so we can track it and take the eye out the other end?
Is that in terms of kind of vanity metrics about maybe time spent learning versus if our goal was to help the sales team close more deals or move more people down the funnel, the metric would be the number of people moved down the funnel, wouldn't it, as opposed to necessarily needing to just create an arbitrary metric? Is that a correct assumption? Or
yeah, you can't. Yeah, I would also say it always has to be a number, doesn't it? I mean, we started calling ourselves human capital because we were trying to become a finance department for human beings and not put everything to a number. What about the qualitative kind of research, asking people, what have you done this month to make yourself more valuable to the organization and grow yourself compared to last month? There are so many ways we can do qualitative surveys now and actually get the sentiment from that. I think trying to put a number to it now is so 2019.
yeah, I think you definitely need to do both, because otherwise you can't tell a good story. Like, no one wants to just hear 72%. They want to hear, well, what did the individual at the end of that training, did it improve their confidence, their skill set, their sense of belonging in the company, whatever that human element is, that has to be there as well. Adam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, there's normally a number you can find, but like Harry said, it's about finding the right number. It's not necessarily course completions or time spent. It's the impact metric, which is trickier with soft skills, leadership development, stuff like that. But there is often, like Anthony said, combining that with the stories behind what people are experiencing. And then, maybe a metric is to reduce the staff churn. In businesses like fast food chains, for example, staff churn is an enormous problem. So, if you can link up what you're doing to reducing that, a number, but also you're getting a metric from people that they're happier and better and more fulfilled at work, then that combination is your kind of is the gold, really. I would say, just from a practical point of view, Anthony's spot on. Companies have to be doing what he's saying, and learning development needs a seat at the table. How do you then implement that in the most effective way? And from quite a few of the interviews we did earlier in the year, the number one thing that came back again and again was listen. And this isn't necessarily listen and do what people say, because everyone will have different ideas, but this is spend time listening to all the different areas and work out what's going to be the best way to execute on this plan, on hitting these goals, on helping the company achieve these objectives. And by listening and not just listening, but really hearing what they're saying and applying your own knowledge, experience, learning experience, that's where you get that. That's where you hopefully get that right mix of programs, learning in the flow of work, modalities, whatever you need to deliver on the business objectives.
Yeah, I love this this principle of listening in a more holistic or wider context, because we had a workshop last week. My colleague Alfie joined me, and one of his tips was to listen in sort of every sense of the word. Look at Slack conversations. When people are facing challenges, how do they phrase it? Who do they ask for help? What are the common things that are coming up that would obviously be useful if we solve them? If 10 people in the last 10 days have asked for X, if we provide that to them, we provide useful content, improve their performance, enhance L&D's reputation, and listening in sort of a wider context definitely helps. You would have seen in the chat there, feel free to drop any Q&A questions into the Q&A function, or if you're happy to share them in the chat, do that as well, because we're going to get to them for the last 10 minutes. And I'm going to put a quick fire question to Adam and Anthony quickly, which would be to give you time to drop your questions in. But if you could give one actionable piece of advice to people and organizations to enhance their ability to deliver learning in the flow of work, what would it be? And maybe feel free to keep it as brief as you like, or to maybe a minute, 2 minutes max would be great.
You want
Do you want to go first,
Adam?
Anthony? Yeah, okay, I will. So apart from listen, which is probably my top advice, number 2 would be create networks. And by that, I mean, often learning and development, as we talked about earlier, is a small team. Create networks that extend your reach. So that might be learning networks that pull people together internally. It might be cohorts, it might be, things like that. But actually, it might just be networks with line managers, and it might just be relationships with different departments. Because if those department heads are buying into what you are doing and trying to push out, your life is going to be so much easier. And these these strategies and tactics are going to be supported and pushed by the right people. So networks is my top tip.
Perfect.
And my one kind of builds on yours, actually, because you did mention my one when you're saying it, which was my biggest fear. Actually, anybody who knows me knows that I am absolutely passionate about middle managers. Middle managers are the people who make and break an organization, and we so often overlook them. They are the enablers to engage and motivate your frontline people to feel the organization, to do what the organization needs them to do to deliver. And it's through line managers that you will be able to get the traction of any learning or HR policy procedure that you want to implement into a part of the culture. So I would say, if nothing else, turn it into a great business development function as part of learning, and go out there and sell the concept to line managers and show them the benefits that by being the role model for those frontline people, and actually showing that taking time to learn in the job is a way forward, you will create an infectious positive culture that will just spread through the organization.
Love that. Yeah, I think buy-in is something people can relate to. How do we get buy-in from people to invest in L&D? And what you said there really speaks to that. As promised, we'll spend the last few moments taking any questions people have got. So we've got one in the chat around this idea from earlier. L&D can become a bottleneck for creating content, especially when we take this really perfectionist approach. So any tips for how we can change mindset on that? Now, to add to a point I mentioned earlier, to maybe give you a moment or two to think about this, because I've had a head start on reading the question, it would be to think about the minimum viable quality needed. So for example, is a Loom video going to be fine to guide someone through the steps of completing a process, versus do we need to create this fancy thing with animations, bring in video production? I think that is the mindset I would take. What's the minimum viable quality needed for someone to take that away and apply it? If 5 bullet points is enough to guide someone through a process, 5 bullet points and some screenshots, maybe that would be it. So I think setting the parameters where people at least adhere to that minimum viable quality, but don't necessarily start doing Steven Spielberg style videos for learning at work, that would be my tip. But I'd love to hear, Adam and Anthony, if you've got any thoughts on this.
Says the guy with a filter over his microphone to have Steven Spielberg approach. So I would say don't be a perfectionist is the answer. And actually, if you have people in your team that are perfectionists, you need to change that behavior, because you need to get to the masses. Use the 80-20 rule. At the moment, it's probably the wrong way around. You're getting to 20% of your people and missing 80 of them. What can you do to get 80% of the way there? A great person on LinkedIn and friend is a guy called Wayne Clark, who talks about managers, who's got his own organization. And if something comes to mind, he just turns on his camera, he records it, he sticks it on LinkedIn, and he can be anywhere. He can be in an airport lounge, in the back of a taxi. As long as you capture what other people need to hear, that's all you need to do. And I think, oh my God, I remember John Cleese videos in the 1980s and 90s. And it seems so wrong now. We're so much in the moment. So I think you've got to break the habit, and you've got to hold people to account, but actually it's the reach rather than perfection.
Yeah, one of the best examples of that is, if anyone follows Stephen Bartlett, who does the Diary of the CEO podcast, quite often a lot of his posts are just something he typed on his notes on his phone, took a screenshot and posted the screenshot and the image to LinkedIn. So I think that speaks to that. It's like, what's the best way to capture this and for other people to understand it? Adam, your thoughts on this? Avoiding the perfectionist mindset?
Yeah, it's actually more about the quality of the content rather than the way it's produced, I would say. So, in the examples that you've both given, the people speaking or sharing their notes. The value is in the content itself. So if you're going to spend time developing stuff, spend time on that bit rather than the filming, the recording, and all the rest of it. And, you know, frankly, thanks to technology these days, we could get really good sound quality. You know, you can hear my mic here. It's good. It's not stupidly expensive. You can actually achieve a lot now with lower budgets and do stuff quickly. Most people have got a HD or a 4K, you know, camera on their phone or on their laptop these days. So you can, the technology exists to make all this stuff easier. But yeah, definitely, done is better than great. Is that a phrase from somewhere?
Done is better than perfect is the saying.
Yeah, that perfect I've heard before, and I think that rings true. You know, you have to meet a certain level.
Yeah.
Obviously, that works. And if you are selling it, you know, so if you're selling the content and that's part of your core product, that's slightly different. There'll be expectations and stuff there as well. But as long as you're hitting that level, I think, like Anthony said, it's about reach. How do you hit the 80% instead of the 20%?
Yeah, I think the perfect example with that would be sometimes we'll do like the mandatory training. That's a really great video, but we don't go, oh, I really enjoyed the quality of that video. It will be, but we might watch a Loom video that's 1 minute from a colleague or something they filmed on their phone, and we go, oh, that was so useful because it helped me do X, Y, Z. So yeah, the content over the context and the timing over perfection are the real takeaways for me. Maybe one more question before we wrap up. This one is about we see it a lot, especially in the L&D space, but a lot of things brand themselves as the all-in-one or the one-stop shop. And it's kind of hard to, I guess, nothing can be a one-stop shop for absolutely everything, can it? So just the question, I guess, is to hear your views on how having too many separate logins and solutions and platforms can disrupt the learning journey, especially with that flow of work context in mind.
I mean, single sign-on is one thing. If I was internal, I'll be looking out for, if I was taking on the technology, can it integrate in? But there are so many interesting tech solutions coming down the line. I was at the HR Tech Conference earlier this year, and they're using generative AI to create a platform. So if you wanted to do an onboarding journey for an employee, you could actually just drag and drop all your different systems and what you wanted to do. And in the background, all the coding is written for you. So this stuff is coming. So I'd say keep an eye out on the latest technologies that are there. But if you can't do that, just have links to the different technologies on one homepage on your main part of your internet and use that as your go-to point. But I know it can be really super frustrating. I'm doing some work down at Henley Business School, and I've got the University of Reading, which they belong to. I've got 5 different logins, and I'm only there for like 7 days, and I've got 5 different logins to go through and find all the different stuff. So even the best don't get it right.
Yeah, good point. Adam?
Yeah, agree. Yeah, I would just say, you know, when you're buying anything, think about the learner journey as much as possible, and challenge the salesperson or the vendor on that. You know, so how are we going to get this into the hands of our learners? What's the journey for them? What does it look like? Can you show me it? You know, is that an extra? Is it, oh, I just need to log in here? Okay, they've got too many logins, so how else can we do it? And I think just make sure that whoever you're working with comes with has options, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, funny enough, someone, I think it was Sam, mentioned Miro in the chat earlier, and another piece of advice from Alfie and our team last week was to map out your tech stack on a tool like Miro, because you can create those lines between them. You can work out which ones people typically move between, but you can also work out which ones integrate with each other or talk to each other. And I think it'll help you visualize where the breakdowns are happening. And if you can combine that with knowledge on which tools are most frequently used, you'll find the biggest pain points in that single journey or that fluid journey that people are often struggling with. Perfect. I think we've taken a couple of questions that have come in. Is there anything we missed or any final takeaways either of you like to share before we wrap up?
The elephant in the room, which is we've got to up our game in the learning function, because people have suddenly realized there's something called Chat GPT and generative AI. And I know it's another 80-20 thing, but we were just saying that 80% was enough. So really challenging ourselves as learning owners about actually what is our role, what is our strategic role moving forward, that then we can enhance and lift ourselves up as technology kind of starts doing part of our job for us.
Nice. And Adam, from yourself, any sort of final thoughts?
Yeah, to follow on from what Anthony was saying there, I think think about those skills that are going to be next. What does the future human need in the context of generative AI? And it's some of those skills that Anthony mentioned earlier. It's curiosity, it's creativity, it's critical thinking. And actually it's, how do we start to get ahead of some of those and how people develop in those areas as a way of preparing for the future of work, I would say, because I'm no futurologist, but I don't think AI is going to end the world like some people seem to think. So I think it will take away a lot of the mundane tasks, and it will just change the way that we work and the things that we have to do. And hopefully that will the change is happening very fast, but it means those more human skills are going to become super essential. And like, as a business, that's what we're looking at the moment, is that kind of what does the future human look like, and how can we develop content and skills to help people with that.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think the human-centric part of the AI conversation definitely I think requires a bit more thought. Perfect. Well, we're pretty much at time. I just want to say thanks to everyone who joined us live. That's the most I think I've seen engagement in the chat and people building on what each other have shared. And yeah, love seeing all of that coming through. One final plug in the chat, you've seen, if you want to come and see HowNow in more detail, you can join a live product demo, a group demo next week. And there's a link there. And also you'll get a follow-up email to this that will have links to where you can find Anthony, Tap Solutions, where you can find Adam, Assemble You, and some of their relevant content as well in that email. So other than that, I just have to say thank you both, Anthony, Adam, and then also to everyone who joined us today.
Thanks for hosting, Gary. It's really good.
Sir, thanks everybody.
Perfect. Thanks all.